Where does history take place? Welcome to the sixth and final episode in the first series of podcasts, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Eto na, nasa dulo na nga tayo ng ating first series kung saan we will try to answer the question, saan nangyayari ang kasaysayan? Ako si Vec.
Ako si Lee.
And I'm Aaron. Akalain nyo natapos na natin yung una nating series dito sa podcast. So, congratulations are in order. Congrats.
Congrats,
Yes,
guys.
congrats.
Yes
Alright.
naman.
Next. No? So, parang buhay na buhay ka dun, Vec. Anyway, so nandito na tayo sa huling tanong natin on history. Nagsimula tayo sa why do we study history? We went to asking what is history?
And what is not?
Oh, okay. Tapos pinag-usapan din natin how do we make history and who can be a historian, diba?
And in the previous episode, we tried to answer the question, when is an event historical? So, ang huling tanong natin ay where? Where does history take place?
Naipilit natin yan, ano? Naitanong yung where.
Ang ganda kaya, no? Sakto lang. Pinag-isipan talaga na malagay natin yung 5 W's and 1 H.
Yes, meron talagang design. Pero itong tanong natin this episode, mahalagang tanong ito ha. Very, very important ang geography sa historical study. Fun fact about me, I minored in geography nung undergrad. Madali kasi ako mawala. Alam ni Aaron to, alam to ng mga kaibigan ko. Mahina ang sense of direction ko.
I get
Ikaw
lost
din,
in a
Beck?
building.
Ang laking pasalamat ko talaga na na-invento yung app na Maps. Sobrang amazing.
Pero yun nga, nag-minor ako ng geography kasi I thought kaya pang gawa ng paraan itong aking spatial unintelligence. Pero hindi, joke lang. Interest ko talaga yung geography kasi talaban to ng tao at ng lugar.
Definitely, no? At bumabalik din tayo dun sa kwentuhan natin last time na elements of history, di ba? Panahon na lang yung kulang.
Pero di ba kasi mahalaga rin naman talaga yung lugar kung saan nangyayari yung kasaysayan. And when we talk about place or space, it's not just physical space, right? In this episode, we talk about place in terms of scale.
Kung ang panahon o time ang isa sa preoccupation ng history, parang sabi ni Nigel Thrift, isang British geographer, space is the fundamental stuff of human geography.
And that is true, no? When history and geography meet, in what we know as historical geography, we have several relevant concepts that are also relevant for this episode. Kasi lagi nating nababanggit yung place at space, no? Ano nga bang pinagkaiba nitong dalawang to muna?
Oo nga, definitely. Kasi pag inisip natin, di ba, a place is a space. Pero we can always argue that not all spaces are places.
Places are physical spaces, but not all spaces are physical. Kaya mas fundamental yung concept ng space sa geography. Isa pang fundamental concept ay yung scale, which is the representation of an area as produced and defined by social process, from the smallest to the largest scales.
Parang mahalaga dito yung work ni Lefebvre, yung the social construction of space, di ba? No? So, actually helpful that we differentiated that, no? Kasi we cannot talk about history taking place in specific places na para bang may mga predetermined places lang kung saan nangyayari yung history. Tapos, hindi pwedeng mangyari ang kasaysayan sa ibang lugar, di ba? Pero when we talk about scale, we talk about the many ways history can be imagined to be taking place in, diba?
Yes, and from 19th century onward, certain importance is actually apportioned to the idea of nation or nation states. No, bilang isang scale or bilang isang unit, both of politics and society. And syempre, consequently, dahil naging mahalaga bigla ang nasyon or ang nation state, historical study also focus on the history of the nation, which constituted national history. And such constitution is of course predicated on the idea of a nation. So syempre, 'di ba? Paano naman magkakaroon ng national history if there's no nation to speak of? So dapat meron muna 'yon first and foremost. So the idea of national history actually rests on the assumption that a nation okay, ay something constituted by a people, a government, a definite territory, and a sense of cultural and social cohesion. At itong unit na ito ay merong collective past, okay, na isinishare nila sa bawat isa. So national histories tend to take a nation as a unified entity whose historical trajectory was taken and defined by a more or less homogeneous people, or a people sharing a particular culture, a particular tradition, and a particular experience and environment. And itong trajectory na to, madalas ine-embody siya ng mga pangyayari, certain events and individuals who are perceived to have an impact in the national life. So, kaya dito halimbawa papasok yung mga events na mahalaga sa tingin natin, nationally speaking, like revolutions, mga digmaan, mga sakuna, na madalas sa hindi, itong mga event na to ay kasasangkutan naman ng isa o higit pang mga tao na kikilalanin bilang national heroes or national leaders. So, sila ay pwedeng mga presidente, military leaders, martyrs, writers, pwede ding mga grupo like revolutionary groups, political parties, workers' unions, brotherhoods, mga secret organizations katulad ng Katipunan. So, kung papansinin, all of these events and people or groups that we often take into account in the retelling of our national history can be characterized as nationally significant. And understandable yan, no? Parang gets naman kung bakit national histories tend to gravitate toward these significant events, toward these important individuals. Kasi national history, I don't think there's a national history ever written that was able to capture all specific stories of all specific groups living in specific localities at yung mga event na nangyari na yan within the scope of the nation being talked about. Kasi, malaki yung nasyon, malaki yung bansa, no, bilang isang unit of analysis. So, mahirap para sa mga historiador, sa mga national historians, to look at every nook and cranny of the country that they are studying and to study the nuances between and among localities, communities, and respective and distinct cultures, languages, traditions, economies, and so on. Diba? So, therefore, madalas, yung national history almost always offers a generalized picture of the way a particular nation's history unfolded. Laging ganon, mas pangkalahatan or mas general yung pagtingin. So halimbawa, when we talk of the years 1896 to 1898 sa Pilipinas, ang madalas na pag-uusapan dyan ay yung Philippine Revolution. Specifically, how the Philippine Revolution began, how it ebbed, how it flowed, how it was organized, and how it was led. So, at madalas, itong mga discussion na to ng Philippine Revolution ay gigit na or sa sentro sa mga tao o mga pangyayari na tinitingnan bilang mahalaga nationally speaking. So yan, yung unang sigaw ng himagsikan o ng Tejeros Convention or later on the Battle of Manila Bay or the Pact of Biak na Bato. So anong pagkakapare-pareho ng mga events na to? So what is the common thing about these events that we usually mention in relation to the history of the revolution? They all happened in Luzon. Diba? Specifically in areas near Manila. So, madalas, ganyan tinuturo yung revolusyon. As if the events that unfolded in Manila, Cavite, or Bulacan are similar to the way that people from Visayas, Mindanao, and Highland Luzon experienced this period. So, ito kumbaga yung maging kakulangan ng national history. May kakulangan sila in terms of discussing and threshing out certain nuances within the nation. So, kaya mahalaga, uusbong yung halaga ng pag-aaral ng local history.
Actually, Vec, gusto ko lang din dagdagan yung example mo dun sa Philippine Revolution, di ba? I think mahalaga din siya dun sa mga previous kwentuhan natin about say memory and history, 'di ba? Kasi halimbawa, lagi nating binabanggit na contested yung notion about martial law, 'di ba? Kasi madalas ang picture din ng martial law is from a national lens na nangyari siya sa Pilipinas, 'di ba? Pero pag tinignan natin yung experiences ng mga iba't ibang bayan sa Pilipinas, iba-iba yung danas nila.
Iba-iba din yung alaala nila tungkol sa period na to.
Kaya minsan yung pag tinatanong ako na madali bang makalimot yung mga tao tungkol sa martial law kaya ginagamit ulit siya ngayon, ang sagot ko dun minsan ay hindi siya usapin ng pagkalimot pero usapin siya ng pag-alala. Kasi baka iba yung kontekstong pinanggagalingan ng pag-alala nila. Diba?
Oo, saka, I mean, yung idea kasi ng forgetting, ibig sabihin, may something na kinalimutan. Pero kung in the first place, yung knowledge mo about a particular event, ay hindi naman talaga, wala kang kinalimutan, di ba? Meron ka lang talagang hindi nalaman. Meron lang talagang hindi na
Dahil
i-record.
Dahil hindi mo naranasan.
Exactly. So, yun yung sinasabi. Kaya mahalaga yung local history. Kasi, people and societies, and in fact, majority of them, wouldn't always land at the center of certain events which are viewed to be of national importance. They also have their own histories that, deserve to be recorded, read, and published. Na hindi porket wala sila dun sa thick of the fighting, so to speak, halimbawa. Ibig sabihin, wala na silang kasaysayan to talk about. So, for example, we do not always tell the history of provinces that are far from the metropole. Like, in the Philippines, Romblon, Samar, Zamboanga. Kasi madalas, their stories are sidelined by narratives that are perceived to be of quote-unquote national importance. So, anong nangyayari? Yung focus ng ating national history that often gravitate towards Manila and nearby areas, it tends to alienate people who come from other parts of the country. So, kapag nag-aaral sila ng history, halimbawa, taga Mindanao ka, nag-aaral ka ng history, puro sa Luzon yung place or puro mga Tagalog yung mga tao. So, paano ka nga naman mag-identify sa isang kwento na nakafocus sa mga lugar at sa mga tao na hindi ka naman familiar at nagsasalita ng wika na hindi mo sinasalita? So, the study of local history was initially done precisely to counterbalance that dominating discourse of national history. Pero sa akin din, hindi naman kailangan na makita ang local history in diametric opposite, with national history. In fact, local history can actually buttress and, flesh out national histories by showcasing how national trends can also affect local lives. Diba?
Exactly.
So, for example...
But not necessarily determine, diba?
Yes, not necessarily determine. So, halimbawa, nung 19th century, umusbong ang foreign trade. Diba? Doon una nag-emerge yung foreign trade. Siyempre, sa Manila, sa mga trade houses sa Manila, pinasinayaan nila. So, paano niya naapektuhan yung kasaysayan ng Negros? So, nag-start ngayon dyan yung mga malalaki nilang sugar plantation. And it actually defined the character of Negros as an island hanggang ngayon. Alright? So, para sa akin, yung halaga din ng local history, bukod dito, ay malaki yung ambag niya in terms of the development of historical discipline. Yung disiplina, yung field mismo. Kasi kadalasan, ang national histories, they focus on the political aspect of the past. Mas political history, di ba? Kapag national history. So, syempre, madalas dinidiscuss affairs of the state, achievements of political leaders, mga political events, like revolutions, elections, mga digmaan nga, tulad ng sinabi ko kanina. At syempre, titinan yung mga yan, yung mga political na pangyayari na yan, as events that mattered at the national level. Saka ito din kasi, itong mga ganitong klaseng pangyayari din, madalas, yung mga event na talagang well-recorded, well-documented. Whereas, local history, on the other hand, often tell certain aspects of the local or the community life that may not be political, but more cultural and social. Okay? So, the study of local history also uses more diverse kinds of sources. Kasi hindi sila ganun ka well-documented. Konti yung dokumento. So ngayon, kung ikaw ay historiador at determinado ka na pag-aralan ng local history, halimbawa ng Ifugao, or Mountain Province, anong gagamitin mo? Walang masyadong dokumento dyan. Bukod dun sa mga isinulat ng mga Amerikano later on. Diba? So, gagamit ka ngayon ng oral history. Pag-aralan mo ang kanilang mga artifacts, ang mga existing ritual, ang mga kwentong bayan, at kahit yung kaligiran, di ba? Yung landscape. So, paano yan nagbago? In relation to how people moved and how people lived. So, from here, pag-usapan natin, yung differences ngayon at pagkakaiba ng mga nabanggit na subdisciplines ng history, like political history and then social history.
Exactly. And interesting din, no, that yung divide between the national and the local, and how we tend to really focus on the national. It also represents this focus on political more than any other aspects like social, cultural aspects of history. If I'm going to approach our question for this episode, where does history take place? Siguro medyo literal yung sagot ko dito. Kasi magandang chance din para makita natin yung development mismo ng history as a field of study. When we talk about national history, we usually talk about events that happened in Congress, or events that happened politically among leaders who are usually male. But when we talk about local history, we talk about different aspects, kumbaga everyday Filipino lives or everyday ordinary people lives. Feeling ko beneficial then if we can actually look at the development of history as a field of study. To a certain extent, nabanggit na to ni Vic sa ibang episode, pero balikan lang din natin. Where did history take place in the context of history as a discipline? Interestingly, yung mga unang themes na naisulat sa mga pinakaunang efforts to write history ay mga kwento tungkol sa digmaan. The father of history, this Greek guy named Herodotus, first wrote about the relations between Greece, Persia, and other kingdoms nearby. Although he also wrote about other themes like economics and geography, we see that one of the major preoccupations of the Greek historians was the political life of the Greeks versus the non-Greeks. Si Thucydides naman, he's a contemporary of Herodotus, and definitely, a better historian. He wrote about the Peloponnesian War. Of course, we are all familiar about Athens versus Sparta. Right? This started the tradition of history as the writing of the events of war. So where does history take place in this context? History takes place in battlefields, among political leaders or soldiers, usually limited to leadership positions and institutions, courts among them.
And about, victors and losers. No,
Yes, that's true. So when Christianity became a powerful religion, after the ancient civilizations, after ancient Rome, nadagdagan ng bagong aspect na tinitignan ngayon, yung history. Kasi ngayon, kasama na yung simbahan at yung estado. So the church and the state.
Pupunta.
That's true. And to a certain extent, how these institutions are shaped and how they shape politics.
And power.
We see the same, and power. Power, syempre, malaking usapin yan. And we see the same thing happening in Philippine history and how Philippine history has been viewed. For the longest time, the attention was always at the top level. Philippine history was all about the Datu, the Spanish conquistadores and the frailes, the revolution, the Philippine independence. Kumbaga, halos lahat ng usaping ito ay political. Pero tulad nga ng nabanggit ni Vec kanina, yung scale, kung saan nangyayari ang kasaysayan ay from the scale of the national to the local. Ang gusto kong i-highlight ay kung paano ang kasaysayan ay nalilimitahan ng aspektong politikal. Na alam naman natin na for the longest time ay limitado kasi sino ba ang hindi kasama kapag politika ang pinag-uusapan? At least sa konteksto ng kasaysayan. Sino ba yung lagi na marginalize o naisasantabi ng kasaysayan? E di sino pa ba kundi ang mga karaniwang tao, ang mga kababaihan, ang mga moro, ang mga lumad, ang mga magsasaka, ang mga manggagawa. When history is limited to politics, we lose sight of other places where history takes place. Because whatever makes courts, government buildings, battlefields, and the like historical are the same things that make the factories, the farms, the marketplace, the streets historical.
Exactly. No, naalala ko lang yung 'di ba, yung isang Haitian anthropologist si Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, yung sinulat niya yung Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. Sabi niya doon, 'di ba, history is a product of the dialectic between silences and mentions, 'di ba? For every space that is taken by an account, another account could be marginalized, 'di ba? Pag may nalalagay ka sa isang book, may pinipili kang wag ilagay, 'di ba? So yun yung isang mahalaga din.
Ang ganda, sobrang relate dun sa discussion natin the previous episode about the politics of periodization naman.
Exactly.
So ano yung mga nabibigyang diin?
That's true. The same way that, when you remember, definitely you also forget something. So it's I think the same way that memory works, no?
Kaya importante yung pag-document or yung pag-take notes.
Yes,
diba?
Para ma-represent din lahat. At marirealize din ng mga historiador ito, no? Yung conflict between political and social history, kumbaga. Halimbawa, yung isang group ng historians na tinatawag na Annales School ng France, they downplayed politics and diplomacy and put more emphasis to geography and economics by looking at broad cycles of history in the long term, or what they call the longue durée. Mula dito, nagkaroon ng bagong development sa pag-aaral ng history. Kasi narealize ng mga tao na, hindi lang dapat politika at diplomasya ang pinag-aaralan natin. Noong 1960s at 1970s, lumaganap yung idea na dapat, sa pagsusulat ng kasaysayan, mabigyan ng boses yung karaniwang tao, yung underrepresented voices sa kasaysayan. From these developments came other variants of history like, social history or cultural history. Interestingly, the historians who advocated the study of the social and the cultural aspects of history hated political history kasi elitista, mababaw, at hindi naman daw nito na ipapaliwanag yung pang-araw-araw na buhay ng tao. But this doesn't mean that political history is not important. If we are going to study the history of institutions, halimbawa, like the government or interstate relations, politics still matter, it's still relevant. Pero ang mas mahalagang pag-aralan at pagtuunan ng pansin ay yung political events, yung ideas, yung movements, elections, and other institutions, and not really focus on individuals.
Yes, so magandang tingnan. I mean, hindi siya usapin ng topic kasi historically mahalaga naman talaga yung political topics na pinag-uusapan. Pero it's more of kaninong interest at sinong player yung bibigyang diin mo talaga, sino yung i-underscore mo in these processes. Usapin din siya ng pananaw, ng perspective regarding, sino talaga nagpapagalaw ng kasaysayan. Is it, the leader, the political leader, or yung bang mga tao?
Definitely, no? So, I think yung discussion natin so far, even though we are trying to discuss, diba, na pwedeng yung historical ay in terms of a geographic aspect na pwedeng national or local or something thematic na political or social. Pero at the end of the day, babalik ko lang din yung word na ginamit natin kanina. Usapin din siya talaga, no, ng scope, no? Or, hindi ko alam kung tama yung term or scale nga na ginamit natin, yung scope of inquiry. 'Di ba? I mean, bukod sa national at local history, we can even extend it further, 'di ba? Na yung polls na yon, pwede pa natin siyang i-extend further na history, the development of the field as an inquiry has extended the scope of research to also cover yung mga tinatawag na micro histories, 'di ba? Na pwede siyang mag-focus sa katulad nga nung sinabi ni Lee, isang street, no, or isang individual or even isang object, ganyan. And this is very much a valid research to pursue as any other quote-unquote bigger scales that could even extend to yung tinatawag din na big history or global history, world history, transnational history, international history, na may kanya-kanyang nuances, 'di ba? So, 'di ba? So, mula dun sa scope na 'yon na from micro to the global, no? Napakalaki nung usapin nga doon nung pagde-determine ng where history takes place, no? So kasi history can take place, for example, in an object, 'di ba? Halimbawa, history ng palay, halimbawa, from its planting to harvest to sale, 'di ba? It can go from the cultural to social to political and economic dimensions. Pwede rin halimbawa syempre yung history at buhay ng isang tao, no? Minsan these biographical approaches such as life histories, 'di ba, can reveal so much about a broader milieu, 'di ba? Yung pwedeng yung mga histories ay tungkol sa isang institution. Halimbawa, bigay ko na example yung sarili kong research for my master's thesis, 'di ba? I tried to look at the prison as an institution, 'di ba? No, so it may seem that I'm looking at the history of a prison, pero I'm bringing in a perspective that is wider and global in the sense that I'm looking at a bigger context of empire, 'di ba? Of empire, American empire, and the ideas and the developments about penology and criminology. So it may come from
Pwede ngang modernity, Aaron,
diba?
no?
And modernity, definitely. So it may come from a springboard that is very small to an extent na prison in the Philippines, pero you can extend it that history happens in this particular institution, no, as as a nexus of bigger global histories.
Ang
diba?
interesting, no? Parang naalala ko si Foucault. Diba? Ang inaral
Definitely.
niya lang halimbawa, prison or mental institution, pero in the process, na-question niya na yung buong premise ng modern science.
Ng modernity.
Ng modern
Definitely.
knowledge at modernity
Definitely.
in general.
Knowledge production, di ba?
So,
At
that's
yun
a very
din
good
yung-
example.
Yung ginagawa natin ngayon na we're trying to answer the question, where does history take place? Pero we are implicitly trying to discuss also yung development ng history as a field, 'di ba? As a discipline, 'di ba? So, halimbawa din, 'di ba, in relation to this, aside from yung space element, no, at yung theme na yan, katulad ng sinabi nila kanina, the time element has also been, changed and developed over the course of the historical discipline na a research about, a particular moment na pwedeng nangyari lang ng isang buwan or pwedeng isang moment na isang taon o 2 taon is as much valid as a grand project na longue durée na titingnan mo yung centuries wide, 'di ba? Because this could reveal historical processes in themselves, no? So and then as I mentioned, pwede rin nga yung gano'n na bigger scale na world history or global history. Hindi naman ibig sabihin na pag sinabi mong global ay magsusuri ka ng history ng buong mundo at once, 'di ba? No, so it pertains to a particular perspective, no, a way of looking at events from a global vantage point, no? So to appreciate connections, but not just connections, but how these connections came to be, and how they are understood, contested, and articulated. No, lalo na ngayon na may nangyayari nga yung quote-unquote globalization. How do we make sense of these interconnectedness and interdependence that we seem to find ourselves in, 'di ba? At napakahalaga na pagtingin natin na from a historical perspective,
Sobrang
diba?
ganda ng ganon, natitingnan mo na siya from a global perspective kasi binabasag niya rin yung problema, for example, ng Eurocentrism.
Definitely,
Diba? Kasi
diba?
by employing this, a global perspective, may kita mo rin na, okay, aral natin yung Industrial Revolution from a global perspective. Hindi lang kung paano nag-develop ang mga industriya sa Europa, pero paano ito naapektuhan yung mga Asian or Southeast Asian or
Definitely.
African territories.
Yung idea nga nung development, 'di ba? Yung development paradigm na yung ng modernity discourse na kaya din may lalabas na mga alternative development paradigms, 'di ba? Na ganyan, no? So, yung liberal democracy, is it really a universal thing? Na yung mga ganyan. So, what we're trying to say is in terms of where history takes place, no, we need to think about yung scales, no, yung time and space, no, yun yung sinasabi natin dito, no. So at syempre we also need to point out and underscore yung importance ng perspective, kasi nababanggit na rin naman natin yun since a while ago na mahirap naman talaga mag-reconcile halimbawa ng theory sa history kasi 'di ba yung isang critique doon baka finifit mo yung mga events sa isang explanatory mode sa isang theory, no? Pero perspectives and theories play an important role in the way historians make sense of events and the ways they read sources, 'di ba? These perspectives also influence how we write, whether it is inclined to be a local or national, social, political, micro, or global, 'di ba? So siguro we can even dedicate another series on this in the future, 'di ba? About, for example, postmodernism in history, Marxism in history, post-colonial and decolonial history, 'di ba? So yan, 'di ba?
Wow.
Pwede nilang abangan 'yun in the future, 'di ba?
Exciting.
Yes. Exciting nga yung prospect na yan, no? Pero at least in the context of this primer, History 101, I think we were able to cover a lot of material.
Yes. Ang sayang balikan.
Kasi mali ka naka 6 episodes agad tayo. But simula pa lang ito. Abangan nyo yung susunod namin na series sa paparating in the next couple of weeks. We will be talking about specific events in Philippine history using primary sources.
So, that's a very that will be a very exciting
Definitely.
discussion. So mas mas may detalye na
At
Definitely.
siguro ma-apply natin yung mga pinag-usapan natin
Tama.
about history
Oo, mas applied. Kumbaga applied.
Yung ating 5 Ws and 1 H dito sa Series 1. Tingnan natin
Yes.
siya in action doon sa discussion natin on Philippine history using primary sources. Diba? I can't wait. No? So, you can of course find podcasts in all the main podcasting platforms like Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Spotify of course, Google Podcasts, etc. At pwede nyo rin syempre i-check ang aming website na www.podkas.org. That's PODKAS.org for more content on Philippine history from this wonderful team. Nox.
So, yes, so we are looking forward para sa inyong mga feedback bilang ito ang aming first series, and at the same time your questions. So please follow us on our social media accounts linked in the description. So wag mahihiyang magtanong or magbigay ng feedback because we really love hearing from all of you. So once again, thank you very much for tuning in and have a good day.